The doctor looks at the prisoner standing on the medical scale and cannot believe the number. 78 pounds. The prisoner's name is Wolfgang. He is 18 years old and stands 5 feet 9 inches tall. A healthy male of that height and age should weigh approximately 150 to 160 pounds. Wolfgang weighs less than half that amount. His ribs are visible through his skin. His legs are thin as broomsticks. His face is gaunt with sunken eyes and hollow cheeks. The doctor, Captain Charles Bennett, has seen starvation before, but this is extreme even by prison camp standards. Bennett asks through an interpreter how long Wolfgang has been a prisoner. The answer is 4 months. Bennett asks what Wolfgang was fed during those 4 months. The answer makes no sense. Wolfgang received standard prisoner rations at every camp he passed through. He should not look like this. Bennett orders immediate blood tests, chest x-rays, and a full physical examination. What Bennett discovers during that exam stuns everyone in the medical facility and changes everything they thought they understood about Wolfgang's condition. We are at Camp McCain in Mississippi in September 1944, 3 months after D-Day. The camp holds approximately 3,000 German prisoners of war, mostly captured in France during the Normandy campaign and its aftermath. The climate in Mississippi is hot and humid, and the camp sits on flat agricultural land where prisoners work on cotton harvests and maintain irrigation systems. New prisoners arrive at Camp McCain every week, processed through intake where they receive medical screening, delousing, uniform assignment, and barracks placement. Most arrivals are relatively healthy despite the stress of combat and capture. Wolfgang is different. Wolfgang arrives at Camp McCain on September 12th with a transport of 50 prisoners from a processing camp in Virginia. The transport officer, Lieutenant Mark Davidson, notes in his paperwork that Wolfgang required assistance walking from the truck to the intake building. Davidson says Wolfgang collapsed twice during the train journey from Virginia and appeared disoriented and weak. When Wolfgang enters the medical screening room, Sergeant Paul Richards, the intake medic, immediately sees that something is wrong. Wolfgang moves slowly, shuffling his feet. His uniform hangs loose on his frame. His skin has a grayish pallor. Richards asks Wolfgang in broken German if he is sick. Wolfgang shakes his head no. Richards calls for the camp interpreter, Corporal David Stein, to assist with the examination. Through Stein, Richards asks Wolfgang a series of standard intake questions. Wolfgang gives his name, rank, unit, and date of capture. He was captured near Saint-Lô in France on July 19th during heavy fighting. He spent 2 weeks in a field holding camp, 3 weeks at a transit facility in England, and 6 weeks at a processing camp in Virginia before arriving at Camp McCain. At each location, Wolfgang received prisoner rations, 2 meals per day consisting of bread, soup, occasional meat or vegetables, and water. The rations were adequate to maintain body weight for prisoners performing light work. Wolfgang should not be starving, but when Richards weighs Wolfgang and records 78 pounds, he knows something catastrophic has happened to this prisoner. Richards tells Stein to take Wolfgang directly to Captain Bennett in the camp hospital. This is beyond routine intake screening. We are still at Camp McCain, and Wolfgang is now in the camp hospital examination room with Bennett. Bennett conducts a systematic physical examination starting with vital signs. Wolfgang's blood pressure is low, 90/50, indicating poor circulation. His pulse is 60 beats per minute, slower than normal, a sign the body is conserving energy. His temperature is slightly below normal at 97 degrees. Bennett examines Wolfgang's skin and finds it dry and flaky with poor elasticity. When Bennett pinches the skin on Wolfgang's arm, it stays tented for several seconds before slowly flattening, a sign of severe dehydration and malnutrition. Bennett checks Wolfgang's eyes and sees the sclera are slightly yellow, suggesting possible liver dysfunction. Wolfgang's gums are pale, indicating anemia. Bennett then performs what will become the shocking part of the examination. He asks Wolfgang through Stein to remove his shirt so Bennett can examine his chest and abdomen. Wolfgang complies, and Bennett sees the full extent of the physical deterioration. Every rib is visible and countable. The spaces between ribs are deeply indented. The abdomen is concave, sucked inward toward the spine. Bennett palpates Wolfgang's abdomen and feels the liver edge extending below the rib margin, enlarged and tender. But what shocks Bennett is what he finds in Wolfgang's pockets when the uniform is removed. Wrapped in cloth and hidden in the shirt pocket are 3 pieces of bread, hard and stale. In the trouser pocket are 2 small potatoes, raw and sprouting. Wolfgang has been hoarding food. Bennett looks at Wolfgang and asks through Stein why he has food in his pockets if he is starving. Wolfgang's eyes fill with tears. He says in halting German that the food is not for him. The food is for his younger brother. Bennett asks what brother. Wolfgang explains that his younger brother, Karl, is also a prisoner of war. Karl is 16 years old and was captured at the same time as Wolfgang. They were separated after the field holding camp in France. Wolfgang was sent to England while Karl was sent to a different camp. Wolfgang does not know where Karl is now. For the past 4 months, Wolfgang has been saving portions of every meal, wrapping them carefully, and keeping them in his pockets. He believes that somehow, eventually, he will find Karl and give him the food. Wolfgang knows this makes no sense. The food is rotting and inedible, but he cannot stop himself. Every meal, he eats only half or less and saves the rest for Karl. We are still in the examination room at Camp McCain, and Bennett is processing what Wolfgang just revealed. This is not simple starvation from lack of food. This is self-imposed starvation, driven by psychological trauma and separation from family. Wolfgang has been receiving adequate rations, but has been giving up half or more of each meal to save for a brother he cannot find and may never see again. Bennett examines the food Wolfgang saved. The bread is rock hard and covered in mold. The potatoes are shriveled and growing roots. This food is not edible and has not been edible for weeks. Wolfgang has been carrying rotting food in his pockets while his own body consumed itself. Bennett explains this to Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the head nurse, and to Stein. Mitchell asks if Wolfgang understands that his brother is not coming and that the saved food cannot help him. Bennett says Wolfgang understands logically but cannot change his behavior emotionally. Bennett orders immediate interventions. First, Wolfgang is admitted to the camp hospital for nutritional rehabilitation. Second, Wolfgang must be fed carefully using a refeeding protocol because rapid feeding after prolonged starvation can cause fatal metabolic disturbances. Third, someone needs to contact the prisoner of war administration to locate Wolfgang's brother Karl and determine if he is alive and where he is held. Fourth, Wolfgang needs psychological support to address the trauma and grief that is driving his self-destructive behavior. Bennett writes detailed medical notes documenting Wolfgang's condition, the hoarded food, and the brother's situation. He marks the case as urgent and requiring special handling. Let us know in the comments where you are watching this from. Are you in the United States, Germany, the United Kingdom, or somewhere else? We would love to know who is keeping these stories alive. Mitchell takes Wolfgang to a hospital bed and explains through Stein that he will receive food but must eat slowly and not save any of it. Wolfgang asks what will happen to the food he saved for Karl. Mitchell gently takes the moldy bread and rotting potatoes from Wolfgang and tells him this food cannot be used. It is waste. Wolfgang starts crying again. He says he has been saving that food for 4 months. He carried it from England to Virginia to Mississippi. He kept it safe. Mitchell sits beside Wolfgang and tells him that the best way to help his brother is to get healthy himself. If Wolfgang dies from starvation, he cannot help anyone. Wolfgang must eat and recover. Mitchell promises they will try to find Karl. We are now 1 day after Wolfgang's admission to the camp hospital, and Bennett is implementing a careful refeeding protocol. Refeeding syndrome is a dangerous condition that occurs when a severely malnourished person is given too much food too quickly. The sudden increase in nutrients causes dramatic shifts in electrolytes, particularly phosphate, potassium, and magnesium. These shifts can cause heart arrhythmias, respiratory failure, seizures, and death. Bennett knows that Wolfgang's body has adapted to starvation by slowing metabolism and conserving resources. Reintroducing normal amounts of food will shock the system. The refeeding must be gradual, starting with small amounts and increasing slowly over 2 to 3 weeks. Wolfgang receives his first hospital meal, a small bowl of broth, 3 tablespoons of mashed potatoes and half a slice of bread. The portion is tiny, maybe 300 calories total. Wolfgang finishes everything and asks through Stein if there is more. Mitchell explains that he will receive small meals every 4 hours for the first few days, then gradually larger meals as his body adjusts. Wolfgang says he is still hungry. Mitchell says she knows, but eating more right now could be dangerous. Wolfgang's body needs time to remember how to process food. Over the next 3 days, Wolfgang receives 6 small meals per day, each slightly larger than the last. By day 4, he is eating approximately 1,200 calories per day, still well below normal needs, but enough to start rebuilding. The medical team monitors Wolfgang's blood work daily. On day 2, his phosphate levels drop precipitously, exactly as Bennett feared. Wolfgang develops muscle weakness and irregular heartbeat. Bennett immediately starts intravenous phosphate supplementation and slows the refeeding progression. The crisis passes within 24 hours. By day 5, Wolfgang's electrolytes stabilize and Bennett feels confident increasing food intake further. Wolfgang's weight begins to climb. 81 pounds on day 7, 85 pounds on day 10, 90 pounds on day 14. The weight gain is mostly water and glycogen as Wolfgang's body rehydrates and replenishes energy stores. True muscle and tissue rebuilding will take months. If you are enjoying this story and want more untold accounts from World War II prisoners of war, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We are bringing you stories that most history books never covered. We are still at Camp McCain 2 weeks after Wolfgang's admission, and the Red Cross Prisoner of War Information Bureau has been searching for Carl. Bennett submitted a request with Carl's full name, date of birth, approximate date and location of capture, and unit affiliation. The Red Cross maintains a central registry of all prisoners of war held by the United States, tracking their locations and status. The registry contains over 200,000 names at this point in the war. Finding one 16-year-old German prisoner named Carl takes time. Wolfgang asks every day if there is news about his brother. Each time, the answer is not yet. Wolfgang becomes increasingly anxious and depressed. He cooperates with the refeeding protocol but shows little interest in anything except finding Carl. 3 weeks after the search began, the Red Cross sends a telegram to Camp McCain. Carl has been located. He is alive and is being held at Camp Forest in Tennessee, approximately 400 miles north of Camp McCain. Carl arrived at Camp Forest in late July and has been there for 2 months. His medical records indicate he is in good health, weighing 135 pounds and working on a farm labor detail. When Mitchell tells Wolfgang this news, he breaks down sobbing. Carl is alive. Carl is healthy. Carl did not starve. Wolfgang has been destroying himself to save a brother who did not need saving. Mitchell asks Wolfgang if he wants to write a letter to Carl. Wolfgang says yes immediately. Through Stein, Wolfgang dictates a letter describing what happened to him, explaining why he looks the way he does, and expressing relief that Carl is safe. The letter is sent through official prisoner mail channels and arrives at Camp Forest 10 days later. Carl writes back immediately, his letter filled with shock and guilt. Carl says he had no idea Wolfgang was starving himself. Carl says he received adequate food at Camp Forest and even gained weight since arriving. Carl begs Wolfgang to eat and take care of himself. Carl says the war will end eventually and they will go home together, but only if both of them survive. Wolfgang reads Carl's letter over and over. He carries it with him everywhere, replacing the rotting food in his pocket with his brother's letter. Mitchell sees this substitution as progress. Wolfgang is replacing a dysfunctional coping mechanism, hoarding food, with a healthier one, holding connection to his brother through words. Let us pause Wolfgang's personal story and examine the larger context of starvation and malnutrition among prisoners of war. Severe malnutrition was relatively uncommon in prisoner of war camps in the United States because the Geneva Conventions required adequate feeding, and the United States had abundant food supplies. Most German prisoners held in the United States maintained stable or even increased body weight during captivity. Medical records from 1944 show that the average German prisoner in American camps weighed approximately 145 pounds, slightly below pre-capture weight, but within normal range for men who were not performing heavy labor. Wolfgang's case of reaching 78 pounds represents extreme malnutrition, approximately 50% below healthy body weight. This level of starvation causes multiple organ dysfunction. The body cannibalizes its own tissues to obtain energy, breaking down fat stores first, then muscle tissue, and eventually organ tissue. The heart muscle weakens, reducing cardiac output. The liver becomes enlarged and dysfunctional as it struggles to process the limited nutrients available. The immune system collapses, making the person vulnerable to infections. The brain experiences reduced function, causing confusion, depression, and impaired decision-making. If starvation continues below approximately 40 to 45% of healthy body weight, death becomes inevitable regardless of medical intervention. Wolfgang reached this threshold. He was days or weeks away from irreversible organ failure. The psychological component of Wolfgang's starvation is significant. His behavior, hoarding food for his brother despite knowing it was irrational, represents a trauma response. Wolfgang and Karl were captured together, likely witnessed traumatic events together, and then were separated without warning or explanation. Wolfgang responded to this separation by trying to maintain his role as protective older brother even though Karl was not physically present. The food hoarding was a symbolic attempt to continue caring for Karl. This behavior is documented in psychological literature as a response to traumatic separation, particularly common among siblings who experience forced separations during war or displacement. Wolfgang's case became a teaching example at Camp McCain for recognizing psychological factors in malnutrition cases. We returned to Wolfgang 6 weeks after his admission to the camp hospital, and he is making steady progress. His weight has increased to 108 pounds, still underweight but no longer life-threatening. His strength has improved enough that he can walk without assistance and can perform light activities like reading and writing letters. Bennett discharges Wolfgang from the hospital with instructions to continue a high-calorie diet and to check in weekly for weight monitoring. Wolfgang is assigned to a barracks with light work duty, helping in the camp library and assisting with administrative tasks that do not require physical exertion. Wolfgang exchanges letters with Karl weekly. The letters help Wolfgang maintain hope and motivation to recover, but the psychological scars remain deep. Wolfgang develops anxiety around mealtimes. He sits in the mess hall with his tray of food and struggles to eat the full portion. Other prisoners notice he eats slowly and leaves food on his plate. One prisoner, a man named Erich, asks Wolfgang if he is still saving food for his brother. Wolfgang says no, he is not saving food anymore, but he cannot shake the feeling that eating a full meal is wrong somehow, that he should be saving some of it. Mitchell works with Wolfgang on this issue, using a technique called exposure therapy where Wolfgang is encouraged to eat progressively larger portions, while Mitchell reassures him that this is necessary and appropriate. Over time, Wolfgang's anxiety decreases but never fully disappears. 3 months after his arrival at Camp McCain, Wolfgang weighs 125 pounds. He still has significant muscle wasting in his legs and arms, but his face has filled out, and his energy levels are much improved. Bennett declares Wolfgang medically cleared for regular work duty. Wolfgang is assigned to a farm detail harvesting sweet potatoes. The work is physically demanding, but Wolfgang handles it adequately. He learns to pace himself and to rest when needed. Other prisoners who know his story are protective of Wolfgang, making sure he eats enough and does not overexert himself. Wolfgang forms friendships with these men, finding a new kind of brotherhood to replace the separation from Karl. But every letter from Karl remains the highlight of Wolfgang's week. We are now 6 months after Wolfgang's arrival at Camp McCain, but we need to go back to understand how Wolfgang and Karl were captured and separated. Let us go back to July 1944 in Normandy, France, where the Allied invasion has broken through German defenses and is pushing inland. Wolfgang and Karl were both members of a German infantry division that was rushed to Normandy to reinforce collapsing defensive lines. Wolfgang was 18, a regular soldier. Karl was 16, too young for military service under normal circumstances, but the desperate need for manpower in 1944 led to younger and younger conscripts being sent to the front. The brothers were in the same platoon, assigned to defend a road junction south of St. Lo. On July 19th, American forces overran the position with overwhelming artillery and infantry. Wolfgang and Karl's platoon was destroyed within hours. Wolfgang was hit by shrapnel in his left shoulder, a painful but not life-threatening wound. Karl was uninjured but trapped in a bunker with 6 other soldiers when American infantry surrounded them. Wolfgang, bleeding and disoriented, surrendered alongside 30 other survivors of his company. Karl surrendered with his bunker group. Both brothers were taken to the same field holding camp, a temporary facility where prisoners were searched, processed, and prepared for transport to permanent camps. Wolfgang and Karl spent 5 days together in that holding camp, sleeping side by side on the ground, sharing what little food was provided, trying to understand what would happen to them next. On the 6th day, the brothers were separated without warning or explanation. A transport officer divided the prisoners into 2 groups based on age and physical condition. Karl, being 16 and appearing younger, was placed in a group designated for camps with lighter work details. Wolfgang, being 18 and officially an adult soldier, was placed in a group for regular labor camps. The brothers were given no chance to say goodbye. Wolfgang was loaded onto a truck and driven away while Karl watched from across the compound. Wolfgang spent the entire journey to England thinking about Karl, worrying if he was getting enough food, wondering if they would ever see each other again. That worry became an obsession that nearly killed Wolfgang. We are now in May 1945, and the war in Europe is over. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. Wolfgang is still at Camp McCain, working on farm details and waiting for repatriation. He weighs 142 pounds, nearly back to his pre-starvation weight, though still carrying less muscle mass than he had before the war. The news of Germany's surrender brings mixed emotions. Wolfgang is glad the killing has stopped, but worried about what he will find when he returns home. He has received letters from his mother through the Red Cross. She survived the war, but their home in Dresden was destroyed in the February 1945 bombing. She is living with relatives in a small village in Saxony. Wolfgang's father was killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. Wolfgang and Karl are her only surviving children. Wolfgang receives wonderful news in June 1945. Karl is being transferred from Camp Forest to Camp McCain for consolidation before repatriation. The brothers will be reunited. When Karl arrives at Camp McCain on June 15th, Wolfgang is waiting at the intake area. The moment the transport truck opens and Karl steps out, Wolfgang runs to him. The brothers embrace and both start crying. They have not seen each other in 11 months. Wolfgang looks at Karl and sees he is healthy, taller than Wolfgang remembers, and stronger. Karl looks at Wolfgang and sees the visible signs of the starvation ordeal. The thinner frame, the loose skin, the haunted look in his eyes. Karl says he is sorry Wolfgang suffered so much. Wolfgang says it was not Karl's fault. They were separated by the war. Wolfgang just did not know how to cope with that separation. We are now in January 1946, and Wolfgang and Karl are boarding a transport ship together to return to Germany. The voyage takes 2 weeks. The brothers spend hours talking about what happened to each of them during the months apart. Karl describes his time at Camp Forest, working on farms, learning English, making friends with other young prisoners. Wolfgang describes his starvation, the hoarding of food, the medical intervention at Camp McCain, and the long recovery. Karl asks to see Bennett's medical notes from Wolfgang's admission exam. Wolfgang shows him the documents he was given upon discharge. Karl reads about the 78-pound weight, the hoarded moldy food, the diagnosis of self-imposed starvation driven by separation anxiety. Karl cries as he reads. He says if he had known, he would have found a way to contact Wolfgang sooner. When the ship docks in Bremen, Wolfgang and Karl go through repatriation processing together. They are questioned, examined, and given identity papers. They board a train to Saxony to find their mother. The journey takes 3 days through a devastated landscape. When they finally reach the village where their mother is staying, they find her living in a crowded house with 2 other displaced families. The reunion is emotional and overwhelming. Their mother has not seen her sons in nearly 2 years. She looks at Wolfgang's thin frame and Karl's healthy physique and asks what happened. Wolfgang tells her everything. She holds both her sons and thanks God they survived. Many mothers in Germany lost all their sons. She has both of hers, damaged but alive. Wolfgang and Karl spend the next several years rebuilding their lives in post-war Germany. Wolfgang works various manual labor jobs but struggles with physical limitations from his starvation period. He never fully regains the muscle mass and endurance he had before. In 1948, Wolfgang enrolls in a teacher training program. He discovers he has a talent for working with children, particularly those who have experienced trauma. In 1950, Wolfgang becomes an elementary school teacher in a small Bavarian town. He works with refugee children and orphans, helping them process loss and rebuild normal lives. Wolfgang's own experience with trauma and recovery makes him an effective and compassionate teacher. Karl becomes a carpenter and eventually opens his own workshop. He marries in 1951 and has 3 children. Wolfgang marries in 1953 and has 2 children. The brothers live in nearby towns and see each other weekly for the rest of their lives. They never discuss the starvation period in detail with their wives or children, but the experience bonds them in ways that outsiders cannot fully understand. Wolfgang keeps the letters Karl sent him from Camp Forest in a box in his closet. He takes them out occasionally and reads them, reminding himself that Karl was safe even when Wolfgang thought he was suffering. Wolfgang dies in 1998 at age 72 from heart complications that doctors link to the permanent damage caused by severe starvation in 1944. Karl dies in 2004 at age 76. Their families find Bennett's medical notes among Wolfgang's papers and finally understand the full story of what happened at Camp McCain. Wolfgang's children read about their father arriving at 78 pounds, hoarding moldy food in his pockets, and nearly dying from self-imposed starvation. They are shocked and heartbroken. They had no idea their father suffered so intensely. The documents are donated to a German war museum as part of a collection on prisoner of war experiences. We shift focus briefly to Captain Bennett and what happened after Wolfgang's case. Bennett continued working at Camp McCain until the camp closed in 1946. He treated thousands of prisoners during his time there, but Wolfgang's case remained the most memorable. Bennett later told colleagues that finding the hoarded food in Wolfgang's pockets was one of the most heartbreaking moments of his medical career. The realization that Wolfgang had been starving himself to save his brother fundamentally changed Bennett's understanding of how trauma manifests in physical symptoms. Bennett published a paper in a military medical journal in 1947, describing Wolfgang's case under a pseudonym. The paper emphasized the importance of screening for psychological factors in malnutrition cases among prisoners and displaced persons. What does Wolfgang's story tell us about World War II prisoner of war camps and the psychological impact of forced separation? On one level, it is a story about how trauma distorts decision-making. Wolfgang knew rationally that hoarding food made no sense. The food was rotting. Karl was not with him. Saving portions of each meal was killing Wolfgang while helping no one. But trauma does not operate rationally. Wolfgang's brain fixated on maintaining his role as protective older brother, even though the circumstances made that role impossible. The food hoarding was a coping mechanism, dysfunctional but psychologically necessary for Wolfgang to feel he had some control and purpose. On another level, Wolfgang's story is about the inadequacy of treating only physical symptoms without addressing psychological causes. If Bennett had simply force-fed Wolfgang and discharged him without investigating why he was malnourished, Wolfgang would have returned to the same hoarding behavior and ended up back in crisis. The breakthrough came when Bennett discovered the hidden food and uncovered Wolfgang's fixation on his missing brother.